Hello.
Welcome. I have an amazing thing to tell you.
What?
We are live on Facebook.
What?
It is
I don't
actually
want to be on
working.
Facebook.
Uh-oh.
Here,
Duck and
okay.
cover.
You asked for waivers?
Well, no,
Sorry.
Sit over here, you don't get seen.
that's true. The
Oh.
camera's up there. We can all say hello, Facebook.
Hi, Mom.
If anybody wants to, you can. We've had so much trouble, I sort of doubt anyone will actually tune in tonight because they'll just expect it's not going to work. But if anybody wants to, you can pull up the Facebook feed on the church page and let us know if people chime in with questions or comments or if you like. Let me open us in prayer, and then we will get started with week number 3. Our third plenary session of what if. So let's start in prayer. God, it's good to be together. We give you thanks for these weeks that we have spent in conversation and for the interesting and unique ways that we have been able to help each other process new information and history and culture, and in all things, the life of this church, this wonderful community. And so we ask that you would help us to continue that and have a good conversation this evening and continue to learn and grow and consider not only how we might live our own lives individually, but how we might shape our life together here in the days ahead. In your gracious and holy name we pray. Amen. Okay. So, quick review. We started our first week saying something like the world has changed and the church largely has not changed. In order for us to do ministry in the world in the days ahead, it may be necessary for us to think about the way we've done ministry in the last few decades and consider how we might, in small ways or large ways, reshape ourselves for the days ahead. And this idea of missional church is one of the ideas on how to do that. It's one that's been fairly compelling to me, in part because it goes back to the root. You remember that we talked about the idea of attractional church and how that's really not working very well anymore. It's not, the church in the Western world became an enormous organization under a model called attractional church. So it isn't to say that that organization is entirely gone, far, far, far from it. But it isn't doing the things that it once did, and it seems to keep losing traction and seems to be a less compelling model in the world today. But missional church calls us to remember that we are, as individuals and as congregations, sent into the world by God to make an impact in the world. The Missio Dei, that whatever it is that God is doing in this world is ours to do. God has left us, sent us to be the arbiters of whatever that mission is. First and foremost in the mission, of course, is figuring out what the mission is. So that's the big conversation going ahead. But we summarized missional living last week. We oversimplified missional living last week as a 3-step process. I want to remind you that at the end, we mixed all the stuff that we said about missional living all up, because it isn't really as neat and tidy and linear as 3 steps. But these are 3 components. We talked about starting with creation, meaning beginning with a positive notion of what it is that God wants in the world. A Genesis 1 perspective. God created it, and it was good. And we begin with a belief that this world is a good place, and that the people in it are good people. But step 2 is to find the cracks in creation, a Genesis 3 perspective. That's that narrative that explains for us this concept of the fall of humankind, or the fall of creation. God made it good, something got in it and messed it up. That's a really broad narrative to talk about all of existence, really. So step 2 in missional living is to go into the world and find the cracks. That is, find the things that we think are not the way God intended them to be, or the way that God would want them to be. Step 3 is pretty simple. Once you've found the cracks, do something about it. So that's it. We're all done. We're ready to go. Have a good night. Tonight we're going to talk about step 3 in a little bit more detail. Actually, for this week and next week, we're going to. Sorry. Oh. Could you do a sack full of $100 bills? Thank you. Talk amongst yourselves. Pardon.
Yeah.
I have a strange suspicion you're being made fun of. Step number 3, do something about it. Tonight and next week, we're going to talk about step 3, but we're going to focus in varying degrees. Tonight, if it seems at some point like we're in the midst of a bunch of disparate ideas that have something loosely to do with the notion of doing some work in the world, but they don't seem perfectly well connected, it's because we are. Here's the big question for tonight. One way that I like to sort of flippantly talk about us going out to do the mission of God in the world is that God has called us to do nothing more than simply save the world. That's it. That's all there is. No big deal. So if step 3 is save the world, then in the next hour we're going to talk about the steps to do that? No, of course not. I have some sort of ideas as we go out into the world looking for how we may serve, how we may fill in the cracks in creation, how we can be of some help in this mission of God. Some things that we might keep in mind. It's not even remotely close to a comprehensive list. It's not even close to a perfect list. It's just a few ideas that rise to the surface of my mind often when I think about these things. I want to start as a way of sort of organizing us. I want to start by talking about the river. As we move into the world, this is a metaphor that I think will help us talk about different kinds of causes that we can be a part of in the world. So I want you to imagine that our church is sitting next to a beautiful, babbling, rushing river, like the one that you're looking at. I love First Baptist Church. I love the people for sure. I even like our facilities. I like our neighborhood. But if we happen to also be next to a river like this, that would be just fine. So imagine that we are next to a river, and one day we're all together. Perhaps it's a Sunday, and we're worshiping together. Maybe we've just dismissed, and as we go out, several of us notice up the river there's a person in the water who clearly does not want to be there, doesn't intend to be there, but they're trapped in the rapids. how would we respond?
Son Christopher.
Reach, throw, row, go.
Anybody else?
Throw a rope.
Reach, throw, row, go.
What did you say?
That's what you learn in life saving. You
Oh,
reach,
row,
try to reach,
throw.
you try to throw, you try to row, and you only go as the last
Right.
thing.
All right, so
Right, yeah.
the whole,
That's the
we gotta throw a row first.
Teach that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what we would do. We would in some way go and get the person out of the river because they clearly don't want to. I don't know where these yellow helmets are, but I think we have them around the church somewhere. So if we find anyone in the river nearby, we can do it. But say the next Sunday, we're in worship together again. And when we're done, we look up the river and we see someone else in the river floating down who clearly doesn't want to be there. What would we do?
Same thing.
Do that again. That's our church helicopter. And that's Christopher. Yeah, we go get him out of the river, right? That's what we need to do. And then the following week, we come back together and, those people look like they're swimming joyfully, but they're not. They're terrified. Find more people in the river who don't want to be there. What would we do?
Find out why. Yeah, save them first, and then start to research. I
like that. Save them first. Sorry guys, you gotta go. We would probably go upstream and figure out what on earth is going on, so that we could maybe prevent it from happening in the first place. We might go upstream and find something like this. In which case, what would we do?
Contact your local representative to have that fixed.
I think that's right. We would contact someone and let them know. In some ways, I suppose we could imagine fixing it ourselves, but probably better to contact our local representative. Right? What if we got up there and found something like this?
No.
What would we do?
Put a barricade down the road.
Looks like they're intentionally
Yeah.
doing that.
Put a barricade there?
How are you going to do that?
Actually, there's a lot that we can make of that picture. We could barricade it so that people know this is a dangerous spot. Don't go here. We also see people doing it because it looks fun, and we could, I don't know, perhaps do some education and let people know not everything's fun is a good idea.
It's true. Use it your own.
There again, we could contact someone and have it repaired. Or we could imagine, it is conceivable, say that bridge is upstream, but it's still on our property. We could fix it. Hire a contractor or just put on our gloves and get out some mortar and bricks.
I know. I'd check the insurance policy, but I'd probably knock it down.
You can see how personalities at our church work. They're checking the insurance policy, and I'm putting on my gloves. Ready to go. Christopher's jumping across the river, swinging from the rope. What if we went upstream and found this?
Change the sign.
Obviously, the door sign. There's something wrong with the sign?
Looks like somebody marked out their nose.
Yeah.
No in fluorescent colors. There
You
we
just
go.
get a marker, right?
Right.
Sometimes the fix is actually quite simple. Sometimes it's not. Say if we're back here, if the budget's running low and we call the local rep or call the railroad or whomever and they say, yeah, we're gonna wait on that. Then it might take some more work in convincing them that we've got people floating past our church every Sunday. We need to take care of it, right? Might take some work. The bottom line is, we've done two different things. We've pulled people out of the river because they're in the river right now and they're in a bad spot. But we've also gone upstream to see if we can find the cause. This same kind of thing plays out in the social world around us. We have people who are hungry in the world right now. Right now, meaning someone needs to be able to step up and provide for dinner tonight, for 3 meals tomorrow and the day after that. But somebody's also got to be working on what is the problem underneath that that's causing so many people in our world to be hungry, right? So there are two loose words that I use to describe these two different kinds of approaches in the social world. We could list a whole bunch of other issues too, where there is a momentary impact right now that needs addressing, but also a systemic issue that needs addressing. And the two words that I use generally are charity and justice. Charity being the ability to do something about the momentary right now. Now, those aren't perfect words. There is charity work to be done even in justice work, and charity has something to do with justice as all. But this is sort of the way that I think about if there were a pure divide, this is how I would draw it up. So here's the question. Which of these is the right thing to do? Yeah, there's no getting around that. They both have to be done. And
Yeah, but charity is a temporary thing. What the final answer actually is justice.
But you have to do the charity.
First, yes.
You have to do the charity, because the people who are hungry.
yeah. Now, I would say that within a society, both works need to be done. A particular individual or a particular body of people may feel called more to one than the other. And as long as both are being addressed, and I would suggest being addressed with good communication in between the parts, okay, I think that's fair, right? But both of these have to be done. So as we go out into the world and look at, as individuals for now, later as a congregation, or maybe some of you are collaborating together on your ideas. By the way, I forgot to mention that as we're winding down this evening, I'm going to forget, because it's what I do, I forget things. I'm going to forget that I have a big announcement about the What If program to make. Don't run away without getting the announcement from me. Someone tackle me and make me tell you, okay? Ouch! Oh. Okay, I'm all right. So charity or justice, as we go out into the world looking for...
live with all these years?
What did you say?
See what I've lived with all these years? The understatement.
You may well say so. I couldn't possibly. As we go out looking for how we can serve, how we can repair the cracks in creation, it's worth knowing about this difference. Not everything that we can do in the world fits perfectly into one of these categories or the other. But a lot of times, they do. So we're doing work on both sides of this right now. Our congregation is, or we're involved in it, either through contributions that we make to organizations or work that we're doing here all the time. But it is good to know which we might be engaging in as we go, and to think about, even up front, which we might want to aim for, right? So this then, looking at charity and justice, allows us to talk about two different sort of other just ideas that as we go out into the world are worth holding in mind. If what we're trying to do is charity, meaning we want to take care of the momentary impact of whatever injustice there is in the world, then we need to look out for a thing that's called toxic charity. We're not going. There we go. Which happens to be our second pitfall. You remember we talked about accidental colonialism last week, right? That was our first of two pitfalls that we'll talk about. I'm sure there are other pitfalls in missional living, but here's the second of the two that we'll talk about this month. There we go. Pitfall number 2 is toxic charity. And let me try to say something about what toxic charity is. How many of you have read the book that's been circulating a bit, Toxic Charity? A few of us? Yeah. Good. It's a good book bringing to light an issue that's often not thought about or overlooked or even downplayed. This statement that I've put up there, I can't prove to you. It's based upon my experience. And this is probably taking a slightly different track into the issue of toxic charity than maybe you've heard before. Certainly a little bit different way in than the book takes. But I believe that the will to live a productive and contributive life is a part of who we are as human beings. I think we're all born with that desire within us. But I also think that that part of the human spirit is able to wither away. And some of the things that I think can cause that to happen are generational poverty. I think when you grow up in a world having heard the stories about how your grandparents tried and failed to make a decent living, in watching your parents try and fail to make a decent living, and then getting older saying all the while, I'm going to make a decent living, only to have a failure or two at the beginning. And how many of us don't have a failure or two at the beginning of how many of us don't have failures throughout our lives? But as you get into that, I think that a narrative begins to be created within an individual soul that says, it isn't possible to succeed, so why try? Or at least I've never seen anyone succeed. Or perhaps success is for those other people, but not for me. I don't know if anyone in this world would outright say the words that I just spoke, but I think there's a part of the human spirit that begins to believe that. I think that the desire to be productive, to contribute to society, to make a comfortable living for yourself, I think that piece of the human psyche can just wither away. And generational poverty, I think, is one of the things that does it. Persistent racism, I think, also does it. Michelle Alexander makes this case quite strongly in her book, The New Jim Crow. The system is not, and by the system, I mean all of the systems. I mean the economy, the criminal justice system, all of the system is not kind to people of color. And it's not easy to be a success. In fact, it's often not possible to be a success when you are living in a system that is bent against you. So I think that's another one. The bottom line is anything that strips a person of their autonomy, the ability to be their own person, find their own place in the world, and have that place in the world be a productive existence. Anything that strips that away, I think, can begin to wither. Now, we've probably all been in some spot like that for some period of time in our life, where we certainly don't have the ability to do the things that we want to for a time, but for that to happen generationally, time after time, and throughout a person's life, I think that it can begin to wither away. So that takes us then to the idea of charity. We've talked about things that we generally understand to be negative, that can wither away a person's autonomy. But have you ever thought about the idea of charity? And when I say charity here, I'm talking about specifically, usually financial giving. Have you ever thought about the notion of charity being done in a way that can actually remove a person's autonomy from themselves? You considered that? It can happen, and it does. Whenever a person is in any of the situations I listed there, or any other that's already stripping away autonomy, and an organization or a person, an individual, comes and says, it's okay, we will fix it. And the way of fixing it is to simply spend it away, to give money or to give some other resource that simply would appear to make it disappear, then it takes a person's autonomy. It takes a person's ability to solve a problem themselves away. Now, here's where we thought we're doing a good thing, and yet we have ended up doing precisely the same thing that we've said generational poverty can do. Exactly the same thing that persistent racism can do. With well-intended purposes, we have, when I say we here, I mean all people in the world who want to do good things, have in the past inadvertently created the same impact. We've created a counterproductive, and the term for that is toxic charity. So how does that happen? How do we even get into that place where our giving is actually counterproductive? One of the ways it can happen is when service is separated from outcome. Meaning, well, let me give you the other one because they're related. Service for the benefit of service. When we go out into the world and do something to repair the cracks in creation, there is a bit of give back there, right? It feels good to do good things in the world. But if we're not careful and we let that become our motivation, then what we might have a tendency to do is the third one, move into a quick fix mentality. There are poor people in the world. Being poor means I don't have money, which, by the way, being poor doesn't necessarily mean I don't have money. Being in poverty certainly doesn't simply mean not having money. But we think it does, because that's a simple and quick way to understand it. And so, if I've got resources, I don't want somebody else to be suffering because they don't have resources. It seems like the good thing to do is to provide resources. And so we do that. And then we go away, and we think that we've done a good thing. And perhaps we've tried to do a good thing. But too often, the organization or the person who has given isn't around to find out what the outcome is, how that has actually made a difference. And for that reason, we'll do it again and again and again. And simply giving resources does not address any of the root causes, certainly within the realm of poverty. Simply giving resources does not address the psychology of poverty, does not address giving resources, does not address continued employment. Giving resources does not necessarily directly affect healthcare. These are some of the tenets that cause poverty cycles, right? So those are some of the ways that toxic charity can happen. So the goal of service, this is a way to avoid toxic charity. The goal of service should always be the empowerment of the people we're trying to serve. Not the resourcing, but the empowerment, okay? So as a way of illustrating how that works, in the book Toxic Charity, there is an oath in the book that readers are asked to take, or I don't know, there's nobody there to police it, so I don't know how that works. I guess you just in your living room take the oath. But here's how the oath of compassion, the oath for compassionate service works. There are six points. I will never do for others what they have or could have the capacity to do for themselves. Right? By the way, as we go through this, these are not universal rules for life. I can assure you that when speaking with my family or any of my most beloved people in my life, if they ask me to do something and I say, no, you have the capacity to do that, the outcome is going to be measurable. So these are not immutable rules for life, but they are, I think, good guidelines in avoiding toxic charity. Number 2, I will limit one-way giving to emergency situations. They say one-way giving there because they actually propose that one form of non-toxic charity would be loans, even interest-free loans, but a way of supporting someone for a time in order to get themselves into a better position. And the emergency situations. The writers of this book suggest that if you have resources to give, the time to do that is when there is no other option to support a person to get through the immediate life on the line circumstances and nothing more. That's their suggestion. Number 3, I will seek ways to empower through employment, lending, and investing, using grants sparingly to reinforce achievements. Grants being simply freely giving. So again, they don't say that there's never a time to give, but doing it in support of moving in a positive direction is a suggestion on their part. Has anybody, I wonder, as part of our project this month, has anybody considered using your $100 for a microloan? Anybody familiar with the concept of microloans?
I'm familiar.
Familiar,
Yeah.
but it breaks the rules.
Does it?
Well, basically, if you do it through one of the commercial micro loan services, how do you insert yourself into that? It pretty much separates you from.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I made these rules up. I shouldn't be answering the question.
You go to work for them.
Yeah, it's a fair point.
There's an organization called Donors Choose, which enables teachers who need things to write in and say, I need a lesson such. And so I bought a box full of ukuleles a couple years ago.
Wow.
And my grandkids use it. They find something for their music teacher having to do with music. They find something for their art teacher having to do with art. And to answer your critique, which I think is a valid one, you can insert yourself into it by engaging in correspondence with the kids. I got some wonderful letters from a gang of kids in Hartford about their first trip to the ocean. I got to touch a snake.
That's horrifying. That's horrifying. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think probably the disembodied loaning where you don't know the person at all, for our purposes this month, probably doesn't meet the criteria. Although you have noticed nobody's policing, right? Just so you all know. But there may be other ways to give loans to people? Should you, locally, if you're involved with someone? I think that's one way to do that. Number 4, I will put the interests of the poor above my own or organization's interests, even when it means setting aside my own agenda. This is a statement that I think is far more difficult in reality than it is to just say out loud. Those words sound so silky smooth to me. That's easy. Of course I put my own interests until I'm out in the world and begin to understand what my unspoken interests really are often. I think number 4 is difficult.
Yeah.
Number 5, I will listen closely to those I seek to help. Meaning, this one is, I couldn't fit it on the screen, but it's extended in the book to say that listening closely often means listening to what is not said, because in the silence, you learn a lot about what a person's. This also ties into, remember when we talked about accidental colonialism? We said that one way to try to stem off colonialism is to really know the people, not know the cause, know the issue, but to know the people. Call them by name, know their story. They know your story. When you know someone at that level, then it helps not only with colonialism, but also toxic charity. The last one is, above all, I will do no harm. I think that one should be unstated. I think that one's fairly obvious. So there we are. That's if you'd like a copy of that, I can get it to you. But that's an oath for compassionate service. Some pretty good guidelines for paying attention to toxic charity. So that's over on the charity side. That's just a kind of random idea about, as we go out into the world and want to support people in the momentary needs of their lives, thinking about our efforts being toxic charity or not is a worthwhile thing.
Number 1, by the way, I think should have a footnote that except in emergency, like natural disasters.
Yes.
Because, could they have the capacity to help themselves? Certainly, but they just lost their home.
Right.
So we always.
Yeah. And one way that I have thought about that in the past, my church in Austin, when I became the pastor there, I asked, is there a benevolence fund or a pastor's fund or a discretionary fund? Is there anything for helping people who stop in? And in Austin, a city built upon terrible economic roots, terribly racist economic roots, our church, in a very nice part of town that still had the bus line called the Old Maids bus line that ran from one side of town to the other side of town, both literally and metaphorically from one side of town to the other side of town. Meaning that for those who didn't have the same resources as the people who lived in our neighborhood, especially near the end of the month, when social services were running out of resources and turning people away, it was the bus stop was literally right in front of our church. So it was an easy hop onto the bus to get off at our church and come and ask for help. When I learned that dynamic about our neighborhood, I started asking, is there, first week in the office, is there a fund that I can use for that? And they said, yeah, it's, if you open your top desk drawer and look all the way in the back, there's some $20 bills back there. And I said, that's terrible, don't do that. It's awful. So we took that money and put it into a fund where I could actually have safer ways of giving out the money. And when we created an actual fund and found ways to continue to fund it in time, someone said, well, what do we call this thing? It was really we just really needed some words to type on the computer screen so that on our balance sheet it would show up as something. And I said, call it the bridge fund. And the thing that I was thinking, and that's what we called it, the bridge fund. The thing that I was thinking is anytime I use this fund, I want to be helping somebody get over something. I don't want to be contributing to people on a weekly, monthly basis. I want people to be able to tell me what obstacle is in front of them. So I would use it to help people buy a clean set of clothes for a job interview, or to buy a bus pass so that they could get through this week.
Yes.
And they'd have more resources next week. Doesn't mean that I only ever gave one time, and it doesn't mean that I only gave in dire emergencies. But I always tried to make sure if there was someone who just said, I just need money, then usually I would try to refer them to other social services where there were caseworkers who could at least try to help them get on a better path, right? So that's one of the ways that I tried to avoid toxic charity. The other thing that I did in Austin and tend to always do is, even when it comes to things like toxic charity, I have a lot of grace with myself and with the people I deal with. Meaning, sometimes I just gave people some money because they looked like they needed a meal. You've heard my confession.
Well, I
Michelle.
think most pastors would align with that same feeling.
Yeah.
The river,
They knocked on the door of the church. It seemed like wherever I was, they were always going east, not west, and in need of help.
Yeah.
And, you know, you
New York.
did what you best felt you could do.
Yeah.
Gas, the local supermarket.
Yeah.
You had a code to work with that you gave them, and that entitled them to certain amount of money
Oh, wow.
to buy food.
That's a good, yeah, that's a good system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Way with the cards.
Thanks.
I was just noticing your river metaphor was a good demonstration, because my first impression to the second person in the river was, it looks an awful lot like the first person in the river.
Ah,
So, when you see the same person come down the second time, it's a different conversation, right?
yeah, the
We're
intervention
still
might
gotta
be a
save
bit
them,
different.
but,
Yeah.
okay, what are you doing?
Another thing that is at play, John, the same conversation that we were having, another thing that's at play for me when I encounter people who have desperate need is that a lot of these problems, we don't know how to fix them yet. That doesn't mean that we don't try. It just means that, you know, if you look at the statistics on helping individuals up out of poverty, they're not heartening statistics. It's a hard thing to do. I think what that means is that we don't, as a human race, yet understand poverty as a comprehensive issue well enough yet. Same thing with people who deal with severe mental illness. We don't know how to do that well enough yet. So whenever I encounter people who are in dire straits and I don't know how to help them, oftentimes I'll just do what I can. And that's what we do. So over on the justice side, here's one thing I wanted us to chat about. Have any of you, I don't know why I did that. Here we go. This is actually a business term. I think the term originated in the business world, and I encountered it actually when I went to Boston with Baptist News Global recently. We had a little bit of dialogue about wicked problems. Have any of you encountered that phrase?
Only in Boston.
Only in Boston. It's actually, the article that we read and discussed didn't come out of Boston, so it's got to be somewhere other than Boston.
We wouldn't use that.
That we did have pretty good fun in trying our Boston accents with it, which I'm not going to try here.
I'm not familiar with Wicked Tuna.
Okay.
That's a TV program. Catching tuna.
Thank you for explaining. That was awesome.
Catching tuna.
Wicked problems are very complex problems, which defy even a definition, which are the answers to them are certainly multidisciplinary. Even if we don't know what the answer to the problem is, we can at least tell that it's gonna be multidisciplinary, right? And wicked problems are problems that change complexion as solutions are implemented. It's like whack-a-mole. We know what'll fix this, and you start and you have some success, and then all of a sudden the whole picture of the entire problem is shifted, and now you've got to work somewhere else, right? The best, clearest, easiest example of a wicked problem in our world is poverty. It's multifaceted. It's not about economics alone. It's also psychological, but it's also about housing and education and healthcare. It's about all of these different things, and it's very, very difficult. And an example of what we mean by it changes complexion as solutions are implemented, the whole idea of community restoration. It's a wonderful idea that someone came up with a long time ago about, in avoiding toxic charity, let's take the resources that we have, and instead of giving them to individuals to live on, let's use the resources that we have to beautify and restore and invest in a particular neighborhood in order to create more opportunity for the people that live there, and in time that neighborhood may become more self-sustaining. Well, that has worked. That's done good things in the world. And then also raised the tax basis for those properties so high that the people who've lived in them for generations can't live there anymore, right? That's an example of a wicked problem, right? We've done some good work, and now the problem is flipping on its end, and we have a whole other very related problem, right? So I think a lot of times when we're talking about doing justice work, and it's really easy when we're talking about this to go to the economics of poverty, so I'll end up using poverty a lot as an example. But really any justice issue that we face is probably a wicked problem. It's got serious, I think we could say the same thing of racism. Michelle Alexander's book, I think, doesn't use this term wicked problem, but I think that the basic gist of the new Jim Crow is that racism is a wicked problem. And effectively what she says throughout her book is racism started in the US as slavery. Actually, racism in the US started before the US existed. You gotta go way back to start understanding it. But it really had its first concrete outcropping in the US as slavery. And then we did away with slavery, right? But that didn't do away with racism. We certainly haven't done away with slavery entirely.
Everything's been fine ever since, right?
Yeah, everything's fine, hunky-dory, we're good. No, it turned into, there are probably various iterations in between, but the same thing, the same mentality, the same ideas, the same social underpinnings that created and allowed something like racism to happen, slavery to happen, gave us later Jim Crow, right? Her argument is that now we have ostensibly done away with Jim Crow, at least in, there again, just like slavery, we could say, done away with. We have done away with some of the most obvious trappings of Jim Crow, but racism has still latched itself to the social systems of our world. That's where the title comes from, the new Jim Crow, right? We keep having these ideas about how we might deal with racism, and it keeps coming up in new ways. It's a wicked problem, right? So what do? When we're dealing with a wicked problem, we have to reframe the question. In the late 80s and early 90s, a company called Macintosh was doing okay, right? I think in the late 80s and early 90s, somewhere in there, Through the 80s, the stock price of Macintosh was around 50 cents per share. But in the early 90s, it hit about $2. Right? That's a pretty good climb from the late 80s to the early 90s. In the mid 90s, it started falling back down and got back down around 50 cents, 40 cents. And so their company had an issue. And they identified the issue was they weren't selling enough computers. So they had this question. They're a computer company. So how do we sell more computers? And they answered these questions in the way that businesses answer these questions. We need to, we're not having any success on market share. IBM computers are killing us. We're not cutting into market share, so we need to broaden the market. We need to find a way to convince more people they need a computer in the days when people didn't even know what a computer was. So we need to do that. Well, we'll do that with marketing campaigns, and we'll get out on the streets and just talk to people and help them fix. They answered in all these ways. None of it worked. The stock price kept falling and falling. And in 1997, Steve Jobs came back as the CEO. And he didn't ask the question, how do we sell more computers? He said, how do we change the way that people communicate?
See, it's his problem.
Huh? What's that? He said, how do we change the way that people, yeah, and I realize that I'm talking about Steve Jobs, who's, thanks to some biography and documentary work, I think we're pretty aware he was kind of a jerk at this point. But he knew how to reframe a question. And he asked the question, how do we change the way that people communicate? And so he and the company invented a camera. And also a pocket calendar, and a portable internet device, and a calculator, and a health device, and an MP3 player, and a new kind of television, and a phone. All of those things, except they changed the way that people communicate because they put them all together. I forgot to mention a PowerPoint remote control. The stock price of Apple computers today is around $175. Steve Jobs, I think it's safe to say, was kind of a jerk, but he knew how to reframe a question. The question we're asking here is neither how do we sell more computers, nor is it how do we change the way that people, hold on a second, maybe that is part of the question that we're asking. And I will also say that I'm not going to hold smartphones up as the best thing that's ever happened in the world. I don't think they're pure evil like some people do, but we know some negative impact of smartphones in the world, don't we? Right? Solving wicked problems has to do with reframing the question. Here are a couple of examples of that being done in the social world. My first example is going to be another imperfect example, one that I get a lot of inspiration from and also recognize some flaws with. Tom's shoes, are you all familiar?
Yeah.
Good. Someone recognized that in parts of the world there are people with the ability to pay obscene amounts of money for things that are clearly not worth obscene amounts of money. And live in a culture where if you pay an obscene amount of money for something that's clearly not worth an obscene amount of money, then it by definition becomes worth an obscene amount of money. It's a completely odd, bizarre, weird thing that we call consumerism, and it is an embedded part of our culture. Someone looked at that and said, well, consumerism isn't a good thing, but it is a powerful thing. Could we harness that power for something good? And they created an economic system within a company where the absurd amount of money that you pay for a pair of shoes that clearly isn't worth it also goes to funding a pair of shoes for someone else in the third world. That's a clever solution. Now, They manufacture the shoes for people in the third world all in a central location, meaning they pipe in toxic charity. They give things away instead of manufacturing the shoes, instead of paying local shoemakers in the areas where they give them to make shoes, they instead put local shoemakers out of business. And there are various other critiques of Tom Shoes. I think they have some work to do in really making. I also don't believe you'll read and see some people talk about how Tom Shoes is just a capitalist organization trying to capitalize on people's do-gooder instincts. I also don't really think that that's true. Could be, but I don't buy it. I think Tom Shoes is a good organization trying to do good things, and they need some work on how they're doing it. Here's another example.
UTech, the University of Engineering and Technology, was about to open the application period for 2013, so they needed to call students' attention. Lima and its surrounding villages are located in the coastal desert of Peru. In this place, there are many people suffering from the lack of potable water. The presence of rain in this region is almost zero, but the atmospheric humidity is about 98%. Inspired by this, we worked as a team, UTech and the agency, to build the first billboard that produces drinking water out of air. The billboard has a unique technology that captures the air humidity and turns it into drinking water. The billboard has already produced thousands of liters of drinking water. That equals the water consumption of hundreds of families per month.
Que pongan en diferentes lugares, ¿no? Que posible cada anexo, cada caserío, cada pueblo, para que el agua sea generada por medio de los paneles. Vamos a dar realmente todavía, ¿no?
They didn't have a good way to get people clean drinking water, so they put a condenser in a billboard, put a reverse osmosis water cleaner in the pole of the billboard, and paid for the whole thing with advertising revenue. I wish I were that smart. I think that this is the kind of solution we need to be looking for some of the issues that we face in the world. I think that we face a lot of wicked problems. But here's the bottom line of what I'm talking about. Some of the solutions that we've used as examples, certainly Steve Jobs, and the most recent one was a university collaboration. Tom Shoes was just an idea that a guy had. But some of these solutions come from collaborations of people that we know are profoundly smart people. Well, the good news is we have some profoundly smart, quite a few profoundly smart people among us. But we also recognize that we probably do have some limitations that, say, universities don't have, or people who, or Steve Jobs, who was born with this sort of freakish way of viewing the world where he could peer through a problem and instantly know some kind of amazing solution to it. Probably not many of us have that. But here's the bottom line that I want to get at when I talk about wicked problems. We're going to face them. We cannot afford to check our calling at the verge of what seems possible. As we look at issues that need addressing, as soon as we get to the moment that we say, well, we don't have enough money, that's the moment we need to say, okay, then how can we do it without money? Or how can we get more money? We need to ask more questions. Or when we say there's not nearly enough time for that, okay, can we do it quicker? Can we buy ourselves some time? Can we look at this from a completely different angle? Is there a completely different way to achieve the goals that we're looking for? It may be that we find, as we look at some of these issues, that we are not, by virtue of our personality, ability, resources, perhaps we are not equal to some of the questions, but we shouldn't concede that right away. And we should only concede that when we find something else that we can do to make an equal impact, right? We shouldn't be too fast to say we can't. We should deal with some wicked problems, I think. Last concept. Does anybody feel overwhelmed? No? Awesome. Wow, I should have planned more. I use that phrase that I said earlier, that our calling, the calling that God has given the church, is merely to save the world. I use that in two different ways sometimes. I don't know if you feel the same thing that I do, but when I say those words, I get, on one side, I get this rush of adrenaline. God says we have something to do about this. We can be a part of repairing creation. That's an exciting notion. And also, saving the world. The problems that we face are enormous. Any one problem is enormous and complex. Any one problem probably comprises a million other sub-problems, and any one of those million sub-problems are profoundly complicated. It's a hard work that we've been set out for. It's an exciting work, but it's a hard work. So how do we even face up to the emotion of that thing? I can answer in global perspective how the church has at times, not our church necessarily, but the universal church has at times looked at that issue and said, well, there isn't much we can do. Leave that to government, leave that to private industry, leave that to universities, leave that to someone else. We're just a church. We get together and sing songs on Sunday. That's often been, I don't think, the express answer, but that's been what we've been very willing to do some in the past, the universal church. But how do we face up to it, even if we know that our chances of major, profound success are pretty slim? And the answer to that, I think, is the idea of a contrast community. Anybody familiar with contrast community, what we mean?
I have no idea what that is.
So another way of looking at some of what we've been talking about is a theological concept. Let me do that a different way. We have in some ways been talking about the theme of the season of Advent. Anybody made that connection at all? No, because only weird, bizarre liturgical nerds would make that connection, people like me. In Advent, we have said that the world was created good, but something broke it. But God is in the process of repairing it. And we have something to do with that. Meaning we live in an in-between time. God has and is doing something in the world, but that something isn't yet complete. We get to be a part of that. One part of living in that in-between time is recognizing that we have the ability to live into the future even before it's come. Okay? Another way of saying it, the Gospels speak of this notion of the kingdom of God. They speak of the kingdom of God as some, they do in places speak of the kingdom of God as a promise that extends beyond this natural world. Something else beyond. We don't know very much about that. We have these images in Scripture to try to wrap our brains and hearts around what that means. But we also know that the kingdom of God has to do with here and now. So one way of saying that is that the kingdom of God is even now breaking into the times that we live in, meaning we can see glimpses of it. Being a contrast community means to be the presence of the kingdom of God even before it's come. Live into the reality that we want to see even before it's possible in the wider realm. Okay? The other phrase that I put up there is sign, witness, and foretaste. We should be a sign of things yet to come. We, the church, we as individuals. We can live according to principles that are impossible at this point to implement in the wider world. We can live as a witness to something to come. I'm trying to think of examples. I consider myself a wannabe pacifist. I believe in, from an academic standpoint, in the dropping of all weapons, small. And yet, I don't have the political perspective that we should disband the military. That's what I mean by a wannabe pacifist. I want to be a pacifist, but I can't quite get there politically, academically. I can't quite get there yet. But the church can live in ways that exude more peace than we can see out in the world, can't we? It's not purely hypothetical. We can live amongst ourselves in a kind of peace and joy and love that's almost impossible to see anywhere else outside. We can be the change we want to see in the world in micro scale, right? That's what it means to be a contrast community, to live as a people in contrast to what is displayed outside the church, thereby letting the kingdom of God be something that stands against the kingdom of the world. Contrast community. We are out of time, so we're not going to watch that again. I was going to review the clip, because here's where we're going next week. Do you remember the clip? Anybody not here last week? The clip from Apollo 13? So we watched the clip last week in Apollo 13 in the film, but in actual life, when there was a major explosion on the ship that was carrying the astronauts. It disabled parts of the ship. And one of the problems they had to solve in order to get the astronauts home was in the capsule where they had to be in order to return home, they weren't intended to actually live in that capsule for the amount of time they were going to have to. So they had only supplied enough air filters to keep the CO2 from building up to toxic levels for the amount of time that they needed. So they had to figure out a way to clean the air. And there's a part where that message is dawning on the people at NASA. And so someone says, points at an engineer, a scientist, someone, and says, you better come up with a solution to that pretty quick. Cut to some office room somewhere, and he takes, with now a room full of engineers and smart people, he takes a box of stuff. And this is, they have collected all of the things that exist on the spacecraft. And he dumps the box out and says, that's what we have to solve this problem with. We've talked about some of the other parallels to missional church and missional living that we saw in that clip. That to me is another parallel, particularly for churches that are built on and functioning in the model that we have had for decades, for centuries now. The institutional attractional model. Churches that are built upon that, I think, can find a particular parallel in that. We want to find a way to be missional, to be responsive, to be out in the world, to be responding to and working within the issues that are out in the world. But here's our box of stuff that we have to do that with. Okay? We've got a building, we've got a group of people who meet here every week and are committed to one another. We have a few nickels to rub together. There's a microwave over there in the corner. I don't know what good that might do, but it's there if we need it for anything. We've got a couple of flat screen TVs. We've got a few smartphones among us. Every now and then we're able to web stream something. Not reliably, but sometimes it works. We have some things in our box. What on earth does any of that have to do with out there? I don't know. We're going to have to go out there and figure out what all this has to do with being out there. So this is where we're going to zoom in next week. We're still on step 3 of living missionally. But next week we're going to zoom in a little bit further and ask the question, so what is it that we have? But we're going to ask it individually. We might spend a little time doing it kind of corporately too. Who are we as First Baptist Church, and what are the things that we have in our box? Not only material things, but what's the who are we and what do we have to offer the world? But we're going to spend most of our time doing that individually. What are the skills and abilities? What are the time frames? What are the thought processes? What are the career paths that might be helpful? What are the human associations? What kind of networks and friends and organizations are we a part of? We're going to spend most of our time next week kind of having a guided time of thinking through that question. If we dumped out our box and said, that's what we've got to work on poverty, work on racism, work on transportation justice, work on whatever, what's the stuff that's in the box? That's what we're working on next week. And in order to give ourselves a little more space so we can write and chat in smaller groups, we're going to meet down in Hubble Hall next week. Okay? Same time next week. Don't forget on your way out to sign up for strategy sessions.
Big announcement.
Yes, I told you I would forget. Thank you. The big announcement. 2 issues have arisen, and there is one solution. It was a wicked problem, but I think we figured it out. One issue is April is not very long. No month is very long. And this has been a continual theme of many conversations I've been a part of. We've given you $100 and said, go and do something redemptive in the world. Now, go. And that's generated a bit of stress. This wasn't intended to generate stress. It was intended to generate conversation and a few good things in the world. The other issue that I wasn't sure about was we looked at the schedule and tried to decide when a good month to do this program would be in a year. And it settled in April, even though April's not perfect, mostly because April was about the only time, for various other reasons, it was about the only time we could do it. But one of the big weaknesses of April is that our program year basically ends when we're done with this. There's a little bit more, don't run off. We've got some more forum things still before the program year ends. But we're basically into summer. So here we've started this big conversation, and now we're all going to go off into the woods and onto the beach and have our time. Yeah, I know, it's not exactly the same. But the conversation, I was worried the conversation might die. Here's the solution. You've already figured it out. You have now until the end of August to figure out what redemptive thing you'll do in the world and tell your story. Okay? Once we're done in April, the strategy sessions, all the different sessions will stop and you'll kind of be on your own. But we can, if we want to, in the summer, amongst yourselves, or if you want some help from me, whatever, we can get together sort of like the strategy sessions that we're having and help each other. We can still collaborate, we can still work, we can keep the conversation going. But you have until the end of August to do whatever it is that you want to do and tell your story. Make sense? I see people smiling about that, so I think that was a good thing. Okay, that's it.
You okay?
Yeah.
Anything else, Kat?